Wonderful. Hello and welcome. I hope that we are not going to have any technical difficulties. We are so excited to have you all today. Thank you for joining us this evening, and it is really great to see such a strong and diverse group of participants from across Europe and beyond. Of course, we had over 600 people registered for this webinar, so we are hoping to see more of you today. My name is Shooka Bidarian, and I will be your host this evening. I am the Northern Europe Regional Organizer of the Climate Reality Project Europe. I am an environmental correspondent working as the Climate and Sustainability Media and Journalism Fellow at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment and Health. Now, much of my work focuses on translating environmental science into public-facing narratives, and increasingly on understanding how misinformation, disinformation, and greenwashing undermine evidence-based climate action. So this topic isn't abstract for me. It shows up repeatedly in media, policy debates, and corporate sustainability spaces, often in subtle but highly consequential ways. So we're going to very briefly go through the agenda to see what's expected. Today's session is focused on misinformation, disinformation, and greenwashing, not as slogans, but as practical challenges that affect public trust, political decision-making, and climate outcomes. And we're here to clarify what these terms actually mean and why the distinctions matter. Examine how misleading narratives operate in real political and corporate contexts. Explore how climate narratives change public opinion and policy choices. And importantly, equip you with practical tools to recognize and challenge misleading claims without amplifying them. So we are very pleased to be joined this evening by three distinguished speakers whose work sits at the forefront of climate science, finance, and strategic advocacy. Anna Siewiorek, campaign lead for climate and strategy. Professor Michael Mann, professor of Earth, environmental science, one of the most influential voices in climate science, and a leading expert on climate misinformation, and Robin Millington, co-founder and the former CEO of Planet Tracker. So together, they bring perspectives from science, finance, and advocacy. Again, just to quickly go through what we're going to cover today. Briefly, here is how the next 2 hours will look. A few words from the Climate Reality Project Europe manager, Gosha Richley. A short scene-setting segment to establish shared definitions, and a moderated expert panel discussion, Q&A afterwards, breakout sessions applying the ideas to real examples, and finally, wrap-up reflections from our speakers. Now, I'd like to hand over to Gosha Richley, our branch manager, who will briefly introduce the Climate Reality Project Europe and reflect on why misinformation and greenwashing matter for our work. Over to you, Gosha.
Great. Thank you, Shooka, for this introduction. And we have amazing speakers with us today, so we don't want to take too much time, but I think it's valuable for you to learn a bit more about the organization behind today's session. So I would like to introduce you to Climate Reality Project and particularly the European branch, explore what type of work we do and how do we organize people across Europe in climate action. And so the Climate Reality Project was founded 20 years ago, actually exactly 20 years ago, by Al Gore, who you might have heard about before. He's one of the top leading voices in climate action and the former vice president of the US and the laureate of Nobel Peace Prize and the founder of Climate Reality Project. This year we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of our organization, which actually started with the movie Inconvenience Convenient Truth, which was probably one of the first media products that really sparked a broader discussion about climate. And so based on that, the Climate Reality Project was tasked with educating and training people in speaking about climate, becoming more comfortable when talking about climate with their communities, places of work, associations, religious groups. And so initially, the organization focused on training so-called climate reality leaders. And we have, throughout those 20 years, trained 50,000 climate reality leaders, over 5,000 of them based in Europe. And climate reality leaders educate their communities about climate, specifically climate science, climate impacts, climate change impacts, and solutions to the climate crisis. And so the next stage, I would say, apart from educating, which and communicating about climate, which is a big part of our webinar today, is to take action on those challenges. And that's why, as a branch, as the European branch, we drive local and regional climate action through our network. We focus on mobilizing grassroots movements and encouraging our leaders to take action on some of our impact areas, which I will share in a moment. So we move from educating, communicating, to actually taking action, to engaging with decision makers on the climate crisis. And additionally, as a branch, we're part of Europe's largest environmental and climate organizations and coalitions that help us amplify this collective impact, this collective narrative and advocacy work, influencing our decision makers. And we do work within three main areas of impact. So the first one is emissions reduction. Here we focus on subnational activities to decarbonize as fast as possible, while of course maintaining the required funds and fairness. So it's important that we do no harm in that transition to climate neutral reality. In this line of work, we also focus on stopping the new fossil fuel infrastructure, because unfortunately that is still the case, that we need to oppose those projects. So we do focus on that as well. Next is financing a just transition. So here we focus on how important is money and the money flows between financial institutions, be it public or private, and the fossil fuel companies. So here we want to take particular attention to actually leading to fossil-free finance, and then mobilizing as many funds as possible to this transition so that it is properly funded, and also taking into account the fact that the Global South nations have reduced access to those funds. So this is also something that we advocate for, is the access to proper funding to make this transition a reality. And then the last area is the international cooperation. So here we focus on climate diplomacy. We focus on national targets or regional targets, as in case of European Union. And on top of that, we participate or witness the processes of negotiations on climate. So usually you might recall that as the COPs, so the annual COPs, Conference of Parties, where we witness the negotiation processes. And as an organization that focuses on advocacy too, we try to influence that process too, as a representative of civil society. And we do work with coalitions such as Climate Action Network Europe to make sure that our voices are heard. So this is the last areas, but as you can see, these are quite broad, and we're happy to support our network in taking actions in all the three of those. And these actions take various forms. It might be still educating, presenting, communicating about the climate crisis and solutions to it. It might be joining local or national campaigns to stop fossil fuel infrastructure. It might be connecting with the local decision makers on how to decarbonize faster and how to support decision makers in that. So establish a dialogue between those who make decisions and participants, citizens. So this is a more participatory process. So as you can see, these can take various forms, and in order to support our network in organizing to make those actions as impactful as possible, we launched just last year our new initiative, the Climate Hubs model. So this is our way to shift from the more abstract national targets and more abstract conversations about emissions reduction by certain percentages somewhere in the future, to more to something that is closer to our hearts, to our reality. And so that's why we want our network to organize in so-called climate hubs. And this is an opportunity to meet like-minded people and identify areas that are good opportunities to take action, that are urgent to address, or help us to decarbonize faster. And so these climate hubs are run by climate reality leaders, so those who we train, but then are open for anyone to join. So as part of the calls to action after today's webinar, we will of course invite you to explore if you would like to join such a community. So this is in very short what our work is about, and we're happy for this webinar, for a chance to see you all and to have a debate on disinformation and misinformation, which is tremendously important in this current reality, with climate being a bit sidelined, a bit might be an understatement, and us and countries, especially in Europe and in the US, facing the threats of disinformation and polarization. So we're happy to explore that together today with our incredible guests. And so I will now give the floor back to Shooka, so she can introduce us to some of the most important concepts that we need to have in mind when discussing this topic. So thank you all, and I will move back to Shooka.
Thank you, Gosha. That's a helpful context for today's session as well. Let's now move into a short scene setting section to clarify the key terms. Obviously, we have our amazing experts here, so I don't want to take too much of your time, just going through a few definitions before we kickstart the conversation. We're surrounded by climate information all the time across headlines, posts, reports, and claims, but some of it lacks context, clarity, or accuracy, and some is intentionally framed to mislead. So in climate communication, this often appears in more subtle forms rather than outright denial, especially nowadays. And this matters because these narratives shape how people make choices, how policies are designed, and how communities respond to environmental risk. And so the consequences go beyond misinformation itself, contributing to delayed climate action, and you're going to be hearing me saying that a lot today, misguided decisions, and an erosion of public trust at a moment when it's needed the most. So we'll take a moment to clarify what we mean by misinformation, disinformation, and greenwashing, and return to these ideas in the panel discussion with our experts. Misinformation is false or misleading information shared without the intent to deceive. It can be a misinterpreted statistic, an outdated claim, or even a well-meaning post that spreads inaccurate facts. In the climate space, misinformation could look like oversimplified science or exaggerated headlines, often shared by people, even those who may believe that they're helping. But even without bad intentions, it can do real harm by distorting public understanding and delaying action. And of course, Professor Michael Mann breaks down misinformation beautifully into 5 key groups, and we're going to hear more from the expert himself in a few moments. But I'm just going to very quickly go through these 5 key groups with a very quick, short description, just so we have an idea of what they are. Downplay. Oh, it's not that bad. This type of misinformation minimizes the seriousness of the climate crisis and creates complacency and makes the problem seem less immediate than it is. Delay. Just to give you an example, let's not rush into drastic policies. Delay tactic acknowledges climate change, but argues that action can wait. And it gives the illusion of concern while justifying inaction, letting emissions continue and narrowing the window of meaningful impact. Deflection. What about China? Aren't there more urgent problems that we should focus on? Deflection shifts attention away from systemic solutions and toward other issues or actors, often to avoid responsibility. It turns climate into a blame game. And division. Scientists are part of a global conspiracy. They are just trying to control you. Division aims to create distrust and polarize the conversation, turning climate action into a political or even cultural wedge. Division undermines trust in science, institutions, and each other, and it fuels tribalism, making cooperation harder at the very moment we need it most. And of course, doomism. I mean, we hear a lot of doomism these days. It's too late. Nothing we do matters. Doomism promotes the idea that the climate crisis is already beyond saving, leading to apathy instead of action. And doomism paralyzes people and with despair just as much as denial. And it discourages solutions, it undermines collective action, and it hands victory to the status quo. Now, disinformation is slightly different. Now, unlike misinformation, the definition of disinformation that we have is that it's false information spread deliberately to deceive or manipulate. And disinformation in the climate space has often been systematic and strategic, particularly linked to fossil fuel interests, seeking to protect vested interests, create doubt, or stall progress on climate action. So this strategic disinformation campaign has relied on multiple coordinated tactics. And we're going to just quickly also go through some of them. Funding front groups that present as independent while opposing climate action, supporting think tanks that promote doubt through publications, events, and education materials, and publicly questioning climate science despite internal acknowledgement of its validity, like ExxonMobil's internal knowledge of climate change and what burning of fossil fuel does in the 70s. AstroTurf campaigns that manufacture fake grassroots opposition to regulation, and of course, greenwashing and rebranding efforts that mask continued investment in fossil fuels. Now, moving also quickly to greenwashing. Greenwashing is a major barrier to addressing climate change. And basically, by creating the impression that companies or other actors are more environmentally responsible than they are, it promotes false solutions to distract from and delay real, credible climate action. It's more than just misleading PR. It's a powerful way to build public trust, attract investment, and delay real accountability, all while continuing business and as usual. And Planet Tracker has identified 6 distinct types of greenwashing, which I really find useful. These types of greenwashing that companies use to mislead stakeholders about their environmental performance. And of course, we will hear more about it from Robin during our panel discussion. We're going to go through the 6 types very quickly as well. So the first one is greencrowding. This is when companies hide in a group to appear sustainable, relying on alliances to mask slow progress. A good example of that would be financial institutions in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Many banks and asset managers joined the alliance, but continued investing heavily in fossil fuels, using their membership to signal commitment while taking minimal real action. Greenlighting. Greenlighting is when a company highlights a small green action to distract from a much larger environmental damage. The focus stays on the good while the bigger issues go unnoticed. And a good example of greenlighting would be, again, ExxonMobil, which promoted investments in algae-based biofuels and low-carbon technologies. And of course, despite advertising these efforts, over 99% of ExxonMobil's capital spending remains in oil and gas. And next, we have green shifting. Green shifting is shifting responsibility onto consumers, encouraging individuals to change behavior while downplaying the company's own environmental impact. And a good example of that would be Coca-Cola's emphasis on consumer recycling. Coca-Cola encourages consumers to recycle, implying that waste issue is their responsibility, while continuing to produce billions of single-use plastic bottles. And of course, they are one of the world's top plastic polluters. Next is green labeling. Green labeling happens when something is branded as eco-friendly or sustainable, but the claim is misleading or vague. And a good example of that is H&M's Conscious collection. H&M marketed certain clothing lines as sustainable without providing sufficient information on environmental impact or what made them really conscious. And so the lack of clear standards and that vague messaging led to accusations of misleading green claims for the company. Next is green rinsing. Green rinsing is when companies keep changing their environmental goals before meeting them. They update targets frequently, creating the illusion of progress without delivering results. And a good example of that is Nestle's shifting sustainability targets. We have seen that frequently. Nestle has frequently updated and delayed its sustainability goals related to plastic packaging and emissions. And these frequent changes can make it appear responsive while avoiding accountability for unmet past promises. And last is greenhushing. Here, companies downplay or hide their sustainability work to avoid scrutiny. They may be doing something good, but don't like to talk about it, don't want to talk about it in detail to judge investor or even public questioning. And a good example of that is HSBC. HSBC has been accused of greenwashing actually by underreporting the extent of its sustainable assets. So yeah, I'm sorry I tried to be very quick because we have our experts here to tell us more about it. Just a quick overview of what these definitions are. So with that, I think we've set the scene and familiarized ourselves with some of the key terms. And you'll be hearing throughout today's discussion from our experts. And again, once more, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished speakers. Anna Siewiorek, Campaign Lead in Climate and Strategy, Michael E. Mann, Professor of Earth and Environmental Science and Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability and the Media at the University of Pennsylvania, and Robin Millington, co-founder and the former CEO of Planet Tracker. A very welcome to all of you. It is such a pleasure to have you all with us today. I'm going to go directly to my questions, and I'm going to start with you, Anna. You work directly on organized climate disinformation, including influence operations by hostile state and non-state actors aimed at undermining climate action. What patterns do you most often observe in these coordinated efforts to block or weaken climate policies?
Thank you, Shooka. Thank you all for having me here. I'm really happy that I see almost 200 people on board here willing to listen and to talk about climate disinformation. This is like the biggest threat of our times, I say. And before answering the question of yours, I'd just like to emphasize that my perspective is strongly influenced by where I live. As a citizen of Poland, my eyes are, well, naturally drawn most eastward. And in Poland, the threat of climate and energy disinformation, because very often I mention climate and energy disinformation nowadays, is not so much related to fossil fuel companies. I'm not saying it's not at all, but it's not so much related to fossil fuel companies, but rather to the actions of certain states. I mean here Russia and Belarus. So there will be more examples and observation of disinformation tactics employed by certain states. And I see a couple of patterns, and the biggest one that is quite visible is the narrative shift. So we come from denying facts about climate change to sabotaging solutions. Recently, last year, there was a big analysis of almost 300 scientific publications. It was run by the International Panel of the Information Environment, if I'm correct. And that publication showed us that fossil fuel companies, think tanks, right-wing populists, and some states, they moved away from the outright climate denial towards more like sowing doubt about climate policies. And the objective is to delay decision making and erode trust in institutions. So that's one pattern quite visible here. The second one is the evolution from bots to hybrid influence networks. Earlier, as you all know, we had this was called like coordinated inauthentic behavior. So simply saying bots mass amplifying identical content. We could see it in the comments, like the same repeated questions, same repeated claims, statements, and so on. Right now, we have more sophisticated architecture. Today, there is like the big role is played by seeders, so-called seeders, and that's like fake outlets or pseudo news sites, very often linked for example, Russia Today. So we have seeders and we have spreaders, so popular accounts, influencers, media, and so on that further disseminate this content unknowingly or often knowingly, that depends. Third pattern I would mention is like laundering, and that terrifies me the most, I would say. It's like laundering and scaling propaganda through AI. And again, there is this Moscow-based Pravda network, and they, instead of targeting people directly with some propaganda and disinformation, they target the data environment that AI chatbots ingest, let's say. So what they do is they flood research results with millions of propaganda articles. And in 2024, it was almost 4 million of such articles. So a big number. And the network ensures that this propaganda is somehow incorporated into AI generated answers. And lately we had an audit run by the NewsGuard organizations, and they found that the 10 most popular AI chatbots, and we can all raise hands here who uses any chatbots, right? So they found that 10 most popular AI chatbots repeated false narratives up to 33% of the time. So 1/3 of the time they were like showing us this propaganda seeded on the internet. And the last thing I would mention is that climate is like a geopolitical battlefield right now. We could learn it, and I'm really happy that it was mentioned in the 2024 NATO's report. They highlighted that they mentioned Russia and China, that they use climate disinformation to basically delay adaptation, undermine energy transition, weaken political stability. And basically, it's rooted in economic interest, and countries that base their energy security on fossil fuels, for sure, they see renewables, energy efficiency, electromobility, hydrogen, etc., as a threat. So they want to do something with that. And the Polish example is that our Poland's disinformation task force, that was a governmental body, they published a report last year saying that basically Russia and Belarus ran something called cognitive warfare campaign, and that was focusing on attacking climate scientists and science and basically promoting conspiracy theories and elevating politicians as climate experts instead of proper scientists. And of course, these campaigns were also targeting European Union and all the climate policies that European Union is trying to introduce. And that's all combined with like cyber attacks on environmental monitoring systems. That's combined with manipulation of data set and so on. So basically, in short, it's like this dominant pattern is like a long-term layered influence operation, not to simply deny climate change, but to paralyze society's capacity to respond to it. So delay, not denial, is the new objective.
Thank you, Anna. And I think building on that, my next question uh, will be for Professor Mann. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. It's such an honor. In your book, The New Climate War, you outline that, just like as Anna mentioned as well, that as outright climate change denial has become untenable. Fossil fuel interests and inactivists have shifted to subtle tactics, more subtle tactics of softer denial, which we briefly touched on. So, which of the 5 Ds do you think is currently the most damaging and why?
Thanks. That's a great question. And Shooka, it's great to be part of this event. Thank you for inviting me to participate. And that Anna did a great job in sort of laying out sort of the broad framework here. So yes, in the new climate war, I sort of outlined these various tactics that have replaced outright denial of the basic science because to a large extent, people still believe what they see with their own eyes and hear with their own two ears. And we've seen that in recent political events here in the United States. It's hard to fool people when they can see that what's actually happening right in front of them. So they've turned to these other tactics, as you mentioned, and ironically, and all of these are obstacles: division, delay, the deflection, certainly. And so I talk about all of those. You're asking me to sort of pick one. It's so tough to do because often they're deployed together. They're interactive, and the whole is worse than the sum of the parts. But I would say the way, and you alluded to this earlier, the way that doomism has now been weaponized by bad actors to convince, those who would otherwise be on the front lines demanding action to convince them that it's too late. And the reason that is so pernicious is, again, it's targeting those who are already on the right side of the issue and leading them from being on the front lines to being on the sidelines. Look, the bad actors, and that's what the latest book, my latest book with Peter Hotez, Science Under Siege, where I also use sort of alliteration, the 5 Ps that we talk about: plutocrats, polluters, petrostates, propagandists, the press in many cases, etc. We are now, and so what doomism has really been exploited by all of these bad actors in a way that really threatens meaningful action because they've already got sort of, you might say, conservatives who, by and large, in the United States and elsewhere, have often been on sort of the side of the fossil fuel industry, have often subscribed to climate denialism and dismissiveness about the clean energy transition. So they've always sort of had them on their side. Now what they're trying to do is to carve out some of the people on the other side, to get progressives, environmental progressives, to give up the fight. And that's a huge win for them to the extent that they can do it. So this is, a lot of my messaging these days is really, about that. The truth is bad enough. We don't have to exaggerate, the threat. We don't have to exaggerate climate impacts to make the argument for urgent action. And as I like to say, we need both a sense of urgency and agency, that it's not too late to do something.
Thank you, Professor Mann. Indeed, doomism is always one of those that keeps me awake at night and really concerns me because I think that is something that I see a lot more. And as you said, it's on our side of the wall.
Yeah.
They're trying to sort of discourage people like us who are trying to do something about the climate crisis and so on. We see similar tactics in the corporate world as well. And I want to bring Robin in as well. Similar tactics, obviously, we've heard from Anna and from Professor Mann. Planet Tracker has identified various types of greenwashing as well. Which one of those are the most common today and you see in the corporate world, and which are the hardest to challenge for you?
Well, first, Shooka, thank you very much for the opportunity to join. The Climate Reality Project has been a great ally over the years, and I really appreciate the chance to work with you on this. So first, I want to dial back. Those I see several of you on this that might know me from the past. I was one of the people that helped create the European Climate Foundation. And so, in many ways, I feel like I've been in the climate wars for a very long time. And of course, if you scale back, if we go back to 2009 and the collapse of the Copenhagen Climate Summit, and then there was the whole Climate Gate attack on emails being leaked from one of the universities, trying to twist those emails into seeming like there was some conspiracy to try and fool people. It was all about the climate denial issue. But we've come a long way since then. I mean, Planet Tracker got very involved in pushing back on that. We had the 4 Rs. It was rebut, reframe, and refresh, right? So you rebut the wrong stuff, you reframe it with the right stuff, and then you refresh it with the positive news piece that was going out into the world. And we helped create that GSCC, which is a global news group that tries to put out that kind of positive messaging about climate, but that was then. So we're coming now into today's world. And as you saw, Planet Tracker identified 6 kinds of greenwashing, some of which I would think have kind of gone down a little bit. I think that things like the green labeling have been gotten a hold of. There have been a lot of legal suits. There have been, competition market authorities and advertising authorities that are starting to really get on top of it. Of course, with the European Union greenwashing, a directive that's coming in this year, there's a push now to start really defining. I think one of the problems has been, and as you can say, we're green, but what does that mean? So there's a huge push now to start really putting definition on the descriptions that are being used to describe what does it mean when you say we are a green business. What does that mean? I mean, how do you actually define a health bar if you're looking at food? You say it's healthy because it has protein, but then you look at the ultra processing and it's so full of other things. People are getting away with this because there hasn't been a regulation around it. So I think that the green labeling is decreasing. If I see one particular thing that's really on the rise right now, it's green hushing. But I want to be more positive about it than you were, because I actually think that there are a lot of companies and a lot of finance people that are doing positive things that are really trying to keep the movement going, but they're green hushing because they're so afraid of getting hit. And it's hit from all sides. It's hit by the political environment right now, but it's also hit by the activist environment. Everything has become so polarized that they can be doing good things, but then they're being told they're not, they're not, they're not. And if they say, but we are, then they're accused of lying. So they choose not to say anything, and then they're accused of not doing anything. So I think that green hushing is a big issue right at the moment. And we need to figure out how to allow companies to tell the world what they really are doing without getting hit by the political things that are happening or the investment scale back. It's mainly American investors, but the American investment scale back on being too green, if you will. But I think that there are still a large group of European investors that are still really trying. And I commend all of you to look at the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation. They have investment groups that are working across all different issues that are committed investors for the green agenda. And I also just want to offer that we have to be working with corporates. My biggest worry in today's world is how polarized everything has become. And if we just assume somebody's in a corporate role and therefore they're never going to do anything good, they're always looking for the wrong thing to do, it doesn't help change that agenda. And I'm not saying that they're not. I mean, there's plenty of examples of how the corporate world has greenwashed all sorts of things. But I do believe that positive engagement is the only way we're going to continue moving this forward. And even though I know in our community, we want everybody to be purist about this, we want them to do it because it's the right thing to do. I think that there's a huge recognition across a lot of the corporates I'm dealing with that they have to do it for the sake of their business. Resources are becoming constrained. And of course, Planet Tracker was beyond just the climate issue and emissions. We were working on food systems, water, environmental issues, plastics. And if you look at the recognition of what duty of care for the ongoing concern of a corporation, you have to be thinking, if the coffee crops, if the cacao crops are not doing well because of drought in a certain area, you're recognizing that that area is close to the equator. It's just going to become hotter and hotter. It takes 5 years to move and build another set of crops some year. You can't plant trees and have crops the next year. So a lot of companies in the green hushing concept are planning forward on all of this and are saying to themselves and are saying to the investors, we recognize that this has to be addressed. Now, how do we create a space where we allow them to say that out loud, where we allow us to come into dialogue, where we allow this to be part of the narrative that we are all in right now? One last thing. In terms of narrative shift, I fully agree with Anna and Michael. We have had the narrative shift away from climate denial. The biggest one that worries me, it vexes me very badly, is this whole idea that in energy systems, we don't have enough base load. You can't go to renewables because you need a base load. And the only answer to that has to be fossil fuel, or maybe it's nuclear. And it really disturbs me because I do question whether we have geothermal or other forms of energy that could actually take up that base load. But that sort of shifting onto we can't do it because we just don't have the technology is something I see and I hear it too much. And I think that that's the new kind of greenwashing, if you will, in this space. Anyway, I think I've probably said enough, and I'd love to have further conversation as we go forward.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, it's sometimes very difficult to also distinguish between disinformation and misinformation, and of course, greenwashing. And we do hear a lot about this systematic and strategic campaigns on the shifting narratives, etc. So I'm going to go back to Anna again and bringing the campaigns that are often well-funded and carefully planned. I know you have worked on this a lot. So how do they typically operate in practice, and how do they influence public opinion or policy debates?
Thank you for this question. Well, I would say they are typically very well funded and carefully planned, unfortunately for us. And in practice, I think they operate on really like multiple levels simultaneously, combining traditional media, social media, online advertising, PR strategies or PR activities. And I mentioned Russia, and we know that they spent roughly $4 billion on disinformation campaigns, but we can also look at like some climate events. You mentioned before, I think Gosia mentioned before, COP. So one good example coming from COP 27 in 2022, according to the Climate Action Against Disinformation report, the fossil fuel companies spent around $4 million on advertisement containing climate disinformation and greenwashing. And COP is just like a couple of weeks. And during that time, there was up to 4,000 such ads on Meta platforms. So this is like a huge amount. Similar situation happened last year during COP30 in Brazil. I don't know about the amount, but again, another research showed us that the number of ads spiked by, and now hold your seats, almost 3,000% between September and October alone. So all the big fossil fuel companies, they really added a lot of fuel to their like ads online. And that's one thing. But also we need to mention that involved a lot of coordinated cross-industry collaboration that is quite difficult to spot very often. And another research I would like to mention coming from PLOS Climate revealed that some industries, and they mentioned oil, plastics, and agrochemicals, all these sectors worked together to undermine the impact of fossil fuels on climate change. They were actually trying to promote fracking and portray natural gas like it's a good bridge fuel, which we know it's not. And researchers analyzed over 100,000 tweets from 2008 to 2023, showing that 9 key companies actively interact each other on back then Twitter to actually multiple and reinforce their narratives. So it's like a big organism. Is for us it's very difficult to combat. And one more or two more good examples, like horrifying examples. I think Gosia mentioned The Inconvenient Truth, the documentary by Al Gore and astroturfing, which is this, creation of an illusion of grassroots movement. I think this is on the rise right now and will be even more in upcoming years. And this is the classical example of this astroturfing. It's called Al Gore's Penguin Army. That was a video created after the documentary The Inconvenient Truth was released. A video created by a 28, 29 years old American, like homemade, the average Joe situation, went viral, a lot of clicks, a lot of comments. And just after that, just after the Wall Street Journal investigation, we found out that actually it wasn't homemade. It was run by the PR firm DCI group connected or hired by the ExxonMobil. So yeah, this is quite problematic. And another thing, influencer sphere, online creator sphere, they play a major role, often really exceeding the reach of public institutions. This is the case of last year during the California's fire. Alex Jones, who's an influencer with, let's say, conservative perspective and inclination towards conspiracy theories, to use some euphemisms. His video on YouTube reached more people than all the news items by traditional media and official institutions combined. One video. So this is quite problematic because we know that young people especially consume that type of content. And we learned that from the research last year that 4 in 10 Americans under 30, they regularly obtain information about the world from influencers. In Poland, it's at least in one of the voivodeships in Poland, we learned that 70% of high schoolers, they learn about climate from social media. So this is quite problematic. And well, the impact of these campaigns is evident. And I will give you a Polish example because I mentioned before that a lot of campaigns are targeting our trust towards European Union and climate policies. So right now, many Poles recognize the benefits of the energy transition. So up to 70% believe that investment in renewables will reduce energy costs, and basically it's our energy security and so on. So we are pro, but simultaneously 70 up to 75% remain skeptical of the European Green Deal, so the deal trying to help us introduce renewables even more. And that demonstrates that even the awareness of the risk is high, this information can effectively suppress support for specific policies. So to just summarize, such campaigns, I think, paralyze public debate, create confusion in social opinions, and undermine trust in science. And basically that leads to weakening national security.
Thank you, Anna. I mean, you gave us some examples. These spending for this are just mind-boggling. The fossil fuel industry allocates over $100 million each year just to lobby against climate policies and fund misinformation campaigns. This is just something that I can't really get my head around it. And every time I ask any of the UN colleagues who are directly involved in the climate negotiations or the plastic treaties. And I asked them, how can we ever get rid of this influence of fossil fuels? And I kid you not, I have not been able to get a proper answer from them. Professor Mann, I'm going to come back to you again with more on the misinformation that we talked about. Some misinformation exaggerates uncertainty, while other narratives create hopelessness and confusion about solutions. As Robin even mentioned in the corporate world, how do these different tactics affect whether people support or resist climate action? Because I feel like they've become even more and more influential. And I see that people seem to be really getting all emotional about it and actually falling for all these disinformation campaigns and that we are seeing, or the misinformation, the 5Ds that we talked about.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's something that we've actually done some research into here at Penn. The center that I direct, the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, which is part of the Annenberg Public Policy Center here at Penn. And we've done some survey research to understand what are the obstacles to people taking greater action, and that can be individual action, it can be being part of systemic action, systemic change. One of the things that we've found is that there's a huge misalignment between the actions that people think make a difference and the actions that actually make a difference. And so there's a real role in messaging to try to better align those things. And some of that certainly is a consequence of this inauthentic activity, social media activity that we're talking about here, the massive disinformation that we find on social media, that we find on podcasts. The sort of podcast world is dominated by conservative voices. There is just such a huge flood of disinformative propaganda that it even impacts those who are on the right side of the issue. People who want to actually do something but think it's too late to do anything, or they've bought into the idea that it's all about individual action, that we don't need, government incentives, we don't need systemic change. It's just about us changing our dietary patterns or what have you. And that has been one of the most effective campaigns by polluters, is to convince people that it's all about individual action. And of course, we should all take part in behavioral actions that decrease our environmental impact and our carbon footprint. And many of those actions are good for us. They save us money. They make us healthier. They make us feel better about ourselves. But the problem is, when it's framed as being the entire solution. And there is some social science research that actually suggests there's a crowding out effect, that people just have a certain amount of emotional energy when it comes to taking actions, being that collective actions or individual actions. And so there is the danger that that there can be a crowding out effect, where if people feel like they're doing a whole bunch of things in their everyday lives that are decreasing their carbon footprint, they actually may be less supportive of governmental policies that they might perceive as costing them. When in fact, even that framing is wrong. That's been a very effective framing by polluters, the idea that taking action will cost us, when in fact it's inaction that will overwhelmingly negatively impact us. I'm not sure. So the question, remind me what the question was again, because I might have drifted off a little bit.
No, thank you so much. I was just wondering, how do these different tactics affect whether people support or resist climate action? And you told us about the survey that you've done.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. It's about making sure people understand what actions they can take. It plays into that notion of agency, the urgency. I think people feel that, the vast majority of people. There's an overwhelming now, if you look at the public polling, an overwhelming majority of Americans actually are aware of the damaging effects of climate change. But they have to understand that there's the agency as well, that it's not too late. And that means individual action, but the most important individual action is being a part of collective action.
Thank you, Professor Mann. Just building on what you said, that it's actually inaction that is going to cost us. Robin, I want to ask you about this very important issue. When greenwashing goes unchecked, what does that mean long term, not just for ecosystems, but also for investors and economic stability?
When greenwashing goes unchecked, obviously it's bad for the economy because we're not doing the shifts that we need to do to secure, if you will, the duty of care, that ongoing concern for any corporate. But I just want to roll that back a little bit. I'm not sure. I think that they're bad actors in everything and they're good actors in everything. And I think the problem is our bad actors in this space are so dominating and they have such deep pockets that they tend to drown out the good actors or the people that are trying to do the shifts. If you're in an investment house and you have your set of companies that you do the analytics on, you're looking at these things. You can't ignore it. You're looking at water scarcity. You're looking at soil health. You're looking at the various issues that are going into what makes the business run, energy access or energy costs. But you're also looking at what is that going to be in 2 years' time? Do we actually make a major commitment to this company or not? If you're in a company and you're being worried about the future of the company, you're worrying about these things. The big issue that's vexing me these days about this particular space is the governance, the G in the ESG. I have been working a lot since I retired with large boards, FTSE 350, Fortune 500 type equivalents. And what I run into is a great number of people on boards that simply haven't caught up to all of this. And they're older, perhaps. They have been in their careers without having to deal with the sustainability agenda or the reporting. And that there is a need for governance training, which I feel has not filtered through enough into most of the major boards. The other thing that bothers me is that those governance boards are setting the KPIs for the CEO and the C-suite. And one of the misalignments that I feel is going on in the corporate space right now is that the incentives, the KPIs for performance are not lining up with the sustainability agenda or even the future resilience of the company. It's so much short-termism. And this is something that I've been looking at in terms of the history of this. If you go back to the 1950s, there was much more attachment to things like duty of care and going concern and fiduciary duty. But if you talk, I was at a meeting with a group of board members, not any of the company I work with, but with some other members. One man slammed his fist on the table and said, I have the fiduciary duty of ensuring that we get profit this quarter. Now, if we have become so detached, and I look at the nano trading, I think it's the automation of the trading systems, and now we're into nanosecond trading, that has detached the sense of how do we actually invest into the long-term health of a company versus my regulatory duty as a board member to create profit for the shareholders this quarter. And I think if we want to get into some of this, we need to get the incentives realigned to get the proper governance going around some of the issues. This is a little bit off-piste from the greenwashing, but it is part of the greenwashing. If we don't have the right incentives, then you don't see the greenwashing. So.
Very well said, Robin. Thank you for your insights. Anna, I'm coming back to you and just a little bit on your experience. You've dealt with this a lot. Can you tell us what you think are the most effective ways for civil society, journalists, and campaigners to push back against organized climate disinformation or misinformation, even greenwashing? But I know you work specifically on disinformation.
Well, I would say the shortest answer is we need a systemic cooperation between all the actors you just mentioned. rather than isolated actions. Because as we already, together with Professor Michael and Robin here, stated that the scale, professionalization, and financial resources behind disinformation campaigns are that big. That means like even strongest individuals cannot compete on their own. So building networks, that's the core. And from the perspective of the Climate and Strategy Foundation, which I represent, it's quite crucial to work with journalists because we see them as the first line of defense against disinformation. Of course, we need to recognize they are overburdened, working under constant time pressure, is increasingly lately exposed to attacks, especially if they cover climate topics. But this is why we invest as a foundation, and I encourage everyone to do so, to long-term education support network programs. So we organize working groups for journalists, from reporters from different newsrooms to meet, train with Polish and international experts, exchange different experiences, learn new tools that are really, really important right now. And we work especially with journalists who already cover climate issues, helping them become even better prepared to detect manipulation and frame climate stories in a way that are more resistant to disinformation. Another thing that I find really important and promising is cooperation with diverse social group. What we did in the foundation was we organized, for example, training series for allotment gardeners because we identified them as a group that is really connected to nature, but also prone. And in Poland, it's like a very big group, at least 4 million people. But I really see potential in like hybrid trainings. So, for example, connecting cybersecurity, information resilience, and for example, first aid, and that could be implemented together with volunteer firefighters or scouting organizations. So we need to really look for different engaging and point to certain groups like initiatives. Third thing is school education. It needs to be designed in a practical, non-burdensome way, let's say. And several years ago, together with one of the biggest fact-checking organizations in Poland, we created a campaign for teachers. But we didn't want to give them extra subject or extra hours of teaching because, of course, they are also overworked. So instead, we created a short 5-10 minutes modules on disinformation and digital resilience. And we added that to the already existing curriculum of key subjects. So students could learn about disinformation during biology classes or mathematics. And well, the last remark, I mean, the success of all these efforts depend on language and tone. And countering disinformation cannot rely on confrontation or shaming right now, especially right now. And I think Professor Mann mentioned that. We need inclusive narratives grounded in facts, but rooted in people's everyday life, showing not only the scale of the threats, but also the tangible benefits of the collective action. And this is particularly important given the dominant emotions today, like fear, anger, helplessness, fatigue. Many people in Poland, but I think that applies to any other countries, they say that there's too much emotions, too few facts, and they start avoid news altogether. They have this information detox, and that, according to the latest research from Poland, paradoxically increases their vulnerability to manipulation.
Very interesting. It's also something that I'm working on, about emotions and how we as journalists or campaigners could actually cut through the noise, and how is that going to work when people are even not willing to listen to those stories anymore. Now, Professor Mann, just touching on what Anna said on journalists and campaigners being attacked, we know that you've experienced it yourself. Scientists themselves are often targeted in misinformation campaigns. But why is attacking scientists and institutions such a central strategy?
Yeah, it's funny. Just yesterday, I was contacted by a Fox News reporter who wanted me to comment on the fact that I and other climate scientists had been quoted in a recent report, actually a report that is sort of debunking climate misinformation and disinformation. And isn't this aren't you a biased source because you are a pro climate change person? And first of all, I'm not pro climate change. Actually, his boss, Rupert Murdoch, is pro climate change. He's actually made statements dismissing the seriousness of climate change. So I think I think he's got that backwards. But this idea that that scientists are biased if they accept what the science has to say, which is that climate change is real and it's a threat. And of course, Rupert Murdoch, his media empire, News Corp, the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News in the U.S., other outlets in Australia, the U.K. That is the largest single source of climate disinformation in the world now, is the Murdoch media empire. And one of the things I've talked about is how these are, these seemingly disparate actors are actually part of a very well organized, very well honed machine, because it's petrostates like Saudi Arabia and Russia working closely with polluters and plutocrats like Rupert Murdoch or Elon Musk, whose takeover of Twitter, which took sort of what had long been this public square for the dissemination of climate information, and they weaponized it now into a massive source of climate disinformation and propaganda. And Musk's takeover of Twitter was leveraged by Russia and Saudi Arabia. So we have to recognize that indeed the forces that are mounted against us are formidable. They're extremely well financed. They're extremely well organized and funded. But we actually have a secret weapon. We have truth on our side, and we have justice, and we have, what the other side has tried to do is to weaponize sort of the reptilian brain, all of our most negative impulses. We can't do that, but because it's wrong and we know that. But we can take advantage of all of these positive impulses that people have, that ultimately recognizing the goodness in people that can be similarly mobilized for positive action. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but I just wanted to get that out there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Mann. And I love that you ended on positivity. Robin, now looking ahead, what single change, I know it's a very tough question, in regulation, finance, or accountability would make the biggest difference in reducing greenwashing?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't believe in silver bullets, so I'm not sure that there's a really single change that can happen. But I have touched on a few things already. I think that we need, in the finance or the governance world, we need regulatory infrastructure that emphasizes that long-term duty of care as much as it emphasizes the short-term fiduciary duty. I think the incoming EU regulations are a great start in terms of trying to get more control over how communication is happening around issues. I'm not sure. Accountability, kind of back to Michael's comments, back to Anna's comments. There's an emotion in this somewhere as well. Don't this array of people that are conspiring to keep the status quo, don't they have children and grandchildren? Don't they care what's going to be happening in the next generation? Is it so narcissistic that it's just, after me, it doesn't matter? Or they think that they're building the wealth so that their children and grandchildren will be stabilized. I struggle with the accountability issue, because if you are accountable, you think about those things. So what is the blockage that keeps these leaders, whether they're corporate leaders, political leaders, I just don't understand what the blockage is on that, except that there's not an incentive someplace to bring them to that understanding. I'm not an expert in behaviorism, but I'm sure there are many people on this call that might be. I would really love to know people's thoughts about Why can't they look to the future for their children?
Yeah, I mean, that's not having, they're being short-sighted. We see that in in policies. We see that with politicians. Everything is short-term. They just want to fix something now, and then they will think about tomorrow later. That's definitely an issue that I'm also struggling with. And I have the same question, Robin. Why can't you just look ahead and see what the future is going to be like and do not care about the future generations, your children, your grandchildren? I thank you so much all for all your amazing insights. I know we need to move on to the Q&A session, but this is very cheeky of me. But I just want to ask Professor Mann one last question, because I've read Science Under Siege, the book, and I can see it in your background. Very quick question, if I may. You describe in the book that attacks on science as deliberate and political. Anna touched on AI at the beginning of our conversation. So my question is, with AI and deepfakes and coordinated online campaigns, are we more vulnerable than ever or better equipped to defend science today?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This is something that we all struggle with because there is the promise of AI and all of the things that it could potentially provide us. It can actually contribute to climate science. It can contribute to solutions. There are all of these ways that we could be harnessing the promise of AI, but there's the peril of AI, which, in my view, and in the book, we argue that the rise of misinformation, disinformation, and the way that AI is now being used to essentially make disinformation go infinite. It has the potential for infinite generation of disinformation. That is the greatest existential threat that we actually face, because it makes it impossible to act on any of the other threats that we face. The climate crisis, the threat of ever more deadly pandemics, and my co-author Peter Hotez is an expert in that area. And so we need to get a handle. We need rules. We need governance in the way that AI is going to be used. And right now, again, we talk about the bad actors. Well, the big tech companies are using their immense wealth and influence to lobby against common sense restrictions on the use of AI. And just the other day, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Meta, rather, whether it's Jeff Bezos and Amazon, we see them active, a small number of plutocrats, in this case, plutocrats not in the fossil fuel space, but in the big tech space, who are working against the sorts of common sense policies that are absolutely essential. Because if we have a disinformed electorate in a democratic system, and we've seen that, there is no way to make progress, and to make progress at a time when we are on the precipice, when we need to make substantial progress over the next several years if we are going to avert truly catastrophic climate consequences. And so there's no path towards climate stabilization that doesn't go through a functioning global democracy and an informed electorate.
Thank you, Professor. We also are dedicating a few minutes to questions from our wonderful audience. Gosha has been kindly collecting them. Gosha, over to you to ask the questions from our wonderful panelists.
All right, there were many. So let's see if we have, I believe we have about 6 minutes, so let's get into it. One question that caught my attention was, given that tobacco consumption has remained high for decades, despite widespread public awareness of its well-documented health risks, to what extent does this illustrate the limits of information alone in driving behavioral change? And what implications does this have for understanding the slow societal response to climate change, even as awareness of its risks increases? So that's a question open to any of our panelists.
I'm happy to
Go ahead,
say
Michael.
a few words here. And it's the playbook. Tobacco wrote the playbook that the fossil fuel industry is using now. And one of the things that they, doubt is our product. That was a line from an internal tobacco industry memo. And what we have seen progress, we actually did see progress several decades ago here in the United States. A lawsuit brought by a group of attorneys general against major tobacco companies that led to substantial changes in government policy. So we made some real progress. We've seen a decrease in tobacco usage here in the United States, a pretty dramatic decrease. But what do? They're global. So they just took their business elsewhere, especially to areas of the world that are more vulnerable to the propaganda and the misinformation. And so we haven't won that. We clearly haven't won that war yet. We have made some progress in certain domains, but it's a lesson that these attacks are global. And even if you can't really solve the problems without some global infrastructure for action.
Robin, would you like to?
I was just going to say it is the playbook that the fossil fuel industry is using. Those of us that came out of the distant past in this climate war know that. But I guess it does lead to my feeling that we do need stronger, heavier, tighter regulations. Most of the investment comes out of Western culture. I mean, the high level of the trillions that go into various companies. So we can't regulate the whole world much as we'd like to. And Michael, I understand your sentiment with that. With the UNFCCC, we're trying to get frameworks in place. But what we can do is regulate in the countries where the majority of investment happens and make those investors really conscious or even have tighter regulations over what is already required for them to look at. These are known as sin stocks in the investment world. Well, let's make sin stocks even more unattractive to put up the cost of capital and make it something that investment doesn't want to do.
All right, so now I'm looking at the time and it's, well, I think that we have some space for one or two more questions. So how do we reconcile our climate values while working in companies that are engaging in harmful practices? The old challenge of having to be with a broken system in order to attempt to fix it. I would be specifically interested in Robin's take on this, considering her position with Shein.
I feel that positive engagement is the only way that real change happens. And there are companies that personally I wouldn't work with. And I am, yes, as you know, on the advisory board, the ESG advisory board for Shein, but I actually am quite convinced that they're quite committed to trying to do change. And if nothing else, it's in their own best interest to do it. It's any business that's in this kind of space using high natural resources is got a wall coming at them, and they have to change the way they do their business in order to survive. And if they're doing the right thing for the planet and the climate, that's even better. And Shein is doing a lot. People don't realize how much they are trying to shift. And I think a lot of companies are, but back to my comments earlier about greenhushing, they get hit by the press, they get hit by things. People say you're lying. How do you tell people that you're not? It's a process. We have to build better systems. We have to build better reporting. I mean, in the investment world, there are a lot of reporting infrastructures now being demanded through the investors of companies like this. You must do your climate report. You must do your sustainability report, that sort of thing. What are your metrics? And I think that is coming. I just wish that we had more regulatory push on it.
Thank you, Robin. And maybe just one last question. I see that the concept of bots was appearing in a couple of questions before. So what I'd like to know is how we counter all of this, right? And how do we fight back? So shall we use the same mass bot strategies to spread the real science-based information? And then another question was also mentioning willingness to learn a little bit more about the bot armies. So what are the effective ways of taking counter action? And I know that we've covered that a bit, but specifically on taking the same kind of practices that our opponents in a way do. Would that be an effective way to counter disinformation?
I don't know if Anna, if you wanted to, I mean, I'm happy to say a few words, but I think
I,
maybe
I
you've
can
got some thoughts.
just two sentences on that. Honestly, while preparing or like brainstorming about certain campaigns, we were considering or imagining the counterattack that hey, we can use the same weapon to actually produce more truthful content and like polluted all the comments with the right stuff. But of course, that requires that was well morally discussed and that require also a lot of resources, but honestly from my perspective the best resource to fight bots is our own education and the way that we just learn how to recognize them and learn how to work with our own emotions, because we mentioned emotions many times, like simply pause and reflect. Do not click the share button, do not engage, do not copy paste, like it or whatever. Just like do not amplify the reach of that particular activity online.
And I would just add, we have to operate in the space that exists, right? We can't unilaterally disarm here. And so we have to think about ways to, honest ways and defensible ways to take advantage of the technology that exists for both the debunking of misinformation, but the immediate pivot into positive information. That's so important. And there's a lot of research that shows that if you're not careful, you'll just reinforce the myth if you don't replace it with something every bit as memorable, every bit as sticky and truthful. And then in the end, common sense regulation to prevent the obviously indefensible weaponization of social media for the massive spread of harmful, damaging, and deadly misinformation and disinformation.
Thank you so much for all your insights, and thank you for answering those questions brilliantly. I know we're going to come back to you at the end of our session for closing remarks. For now, I think it's time for us to move to our breakout sessions. And these will be, of course, moderated. We decided to have 6 groups. And this will be moderated by Jessica Bitch, our program and engagement manager, Gosha Richlick, our branch manager, Anna and Robin, and Professor Mark Maslin kindly supporting us with the facilitation as well. So I hope you found the sessions useful, and I'd like to thank everyone for the contributions. And we'll close with some final reflections from our speakers. And with that, Anna, over to you.
Closing remarks. Yeah, well, I want to say that we did have some technical issues, and not every member of my group could join Miro board. So instead of that, we decided to have a lovely in-depth discussion on the topic. So thank you to all my group, because we were cut in the like mid-sentence. So yeah, and just to close the discussion, I think I would like to leave you with the vision that we need something more than just tackling climate disinformation. But and I started talking about that more broadly lately, and I know that I'm not the only one, is that we need to build a healthy, multi-layered climate information ecosystem that's actually connects a lot of dots. So governments, public institutions, media, NGOs, like-minded individuals as you. And we really need like long-term strategic and well-coordinated action that is also well-funded to do it like morally correct, as Professor Mann mentioned, and not to cross our barriers and our perspectives, but also to gain some success in this uneven fight. And I know that research shows that the societal expectations in the area of this cooperation are really high. In Poland, it's up to 70% of people who really support the establishment of such strategic cooperation among like academia, media, business representatives as well. So yeah, and I would like to just thank you all because you spent 2 hours with us discussing this pretty gloomy topic, but I feel really like elated and empowered with all of you here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for making time to join us today. Robin, may I invite you to come in next?
Sure. Thank you all for, first to my group for a great set of discussions. That was fun. And I don't want to leave on a negative note. I do think that there's a heavy lift ahead of us. It's not easy to come to terms with the disconnect between our community that sees what the problems really are and a large group of people out there who don't. But the important thing is that we don't lose hope, that we don't lose motivation, that we keep working at it as hard as we can. And we do have to push back on the misinformation. That is one thing that I'm very clear about. I think that we each do it in our own way every day. And we just have to continue on our individual levels, on our corporate levels, on our work levels, telling everybody the truth as we were saying earlier, telling the truth has just got to be the pushback against some of the lies that are out there. But I'm pleased to have had the chance to interact with all of you. Thank you all very, very much.
Robin, thank you so much for your insights and for making time to participate in this webinar. Professor Mann, could you share your closing remarks?
Yeah, thanks, Shooka. And I think you'll see that there's quite a bit of overlap in sort of in our remarks here, because I think there is this common recognition of both the urgency and the awareness of agency here, and that's a theme that I'll close on here. It was great being part of this. Part of why I'm optimistic is that nearly 200 people gathered here for the better part of 2 hours. To talk about how we can still win this fight. It gives me quite a bit of optimism. The fact that we're seeing pushback now here in the United States against some of the more egregious actions of the current administration, I think we're sort of nearing a critical point, and we have to keep on pushing, and we have to be, we have to have faith that in the end it will matter. And so I think I'll end on with this with a passage from the very end of our book, Science Under Siege, which we sort of end with this sort of Tolkien-esque framing of this battle as sort of a classic archetypal battle between good and evil, and so we talk about sort of the Lord of the Rings and sort of the message of the Lord of the Rings and how it's relevant here. So let me just read that literally the end of the book. There is something ageless and archetypal about these literary references. They are fictional, but they speak to deep truths and universal themes of good versus evil, heroism, and the time-honored virtue of fighting the good fight, regardless of the expected outcome. And so we choose to do battle against the forces of darkness, fighting back against a malevolent movement that represents all that is bad in the world: fascism, authoritarianism, racism, misogyny, and bigotry. A movement that uses anti-scientific disinformation as its preferred weapon. We do this not because our success is guaranteed. Given the forces mobilized against us, we are clearly the underdog, and no white wizard will come to our rescue. But we have truth and justice on our side, and the stakes simply couldn't be greater. We fight for a livable planet for our children and future generations because it's worth fighting for. So, thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was an excellent way to finish this webinar. Thank you so much, Professor Mann, and a huge thank you to all our speakers for such insightful contributions today. Before I give the floor to Gosha for our call to action, I would like to also, as I always do in my talks and sessions, end with also a quote from our founder and chairman, Al Gore. And he very rightly says, if we don't deal with misinformation now, we won't be able to deal with climate change later. And we are going to be doing that with a lot of optimism and positivity. To close, I'd like to invite Gosha to take us through our call to action. Thank you, everyone.